This is America's first true homeland security.
The most state-of-the-art, largest weapons in the U.S. artillery.
Monstrous guns.
It's awesome.
Absolutely massive.
It was a little self-contained city. They were ready to repel the invaders.
Allied shipping was being torpedoed right off the coastlines. The front lines were definitely here.
We didn't know if he would attack this East Coast or not.
These are Delawareans literally protecting their own shoreline.
And we were ready for anything that come on this coast.
Along this quiet stretch of Delaware State Beach, concealed within the dunes and the scrub pines, stands a monument to those who would protect America's home front during World War II. More than 70 years ago, as the armies of Nazi Germany marched through Europe, citizens along this coast prepared for war. It was here citizen soldiers stood watch and braced for attack as part of America's home guard.
The U.S. Engineering Department, operating on orders from the Department of the Army, decided in 1940 that they were going to build a fort at the mouth of Delaware Bay to protect the Delaware estuary, which included Maryland to the south and New Jersey to the north. And they picked this spot. This is the second largest sand dune between Maine and Jockey Ridge, North Carolina. So you're actually up in the air in a little state that's barely up in the air, okay? This is the highest point on the Delaware beach.
The idea was to control the river, the access to the ports. The plan, of course, revolved around monstrous 16-inch guns. In 1941, early 1941, we started building Battery Smith, which was the 16-inch battery.
Along with Battery Smith, engineers and builders began to lay out a fortress hidden in the sand, bristling with heavy guns and other defenses.
2 batteries of 6-inch guns, 1 battery of 2 16-inch guns, 1 battery of what became 2 12-inch guns, but they also had much smaller guns, 155s, and 8 8-inch railway guns. And on top of that, dozens of searchlights, radar, and really good radio systems. They built these towers as fire control towers. They were used to triangulate and provide fire control solutions for these guns. All of this in response to the perceived threat from the German Navy.
It was built to fight the German surface fleet. They had a mighty fleet in World War I, if you remember. We thought they were going to repeat the same in World War II. We knew about their big ships.
It was a very, very real threat in the minds of the war planners. In 1938, the War Department gamed out a scenario here in the Delaware Bay where a German fleet would come and blockade it, where shipping couldn't get out and get over to Europe where it might be needed. So they increased defenses all along this area.
The units that were here, mostly the 261st Coast Artillery, this is Delaware National Guard. These are Delawareans literally protecting their own shoreline.
The state of Delaware had 2 National Guard units. They had the 198th Anti-Aircraft, and they had the 261st Coast Artillery. When they came back home from training in 1939, that's when I joined the 261st. It's sort of strange, and I sort of put 2 and 2 together, that they had an inkling that we were going to go to war, and they were asking for people to join. And I said, well, I'll join. I was young. I was only going into my 18th year, and it was $1 a night for training. And you know, that was some spending money. $1 back in those days was quite a bit of money to us young kids, and we only got paid every 3 months. And we would train once a week, and then on the end of the 3rd month, they would pay us. And boy, I tell you, we were rich back in those days.
Those months of drill for the 261st would eventually include a trip in April 1941 to a training outpost on the Delaware State coast, known then as Camp Henlopen.
I had a corporal's rating at that time, and so they sent half of the unit on 3-day maneuvers. Well, the first night we were here, we came down, we woke up the next morning, and we were landing water. We had a thunderstorm during the night.
3 days of training quickly became a permanent basing for the 261st, with talk of war on the horizon.
We were to protect the mouth of the Delaware Bay and the heavy industry up on the Delaware River, up as far as New Jersey and up above Philadelphia.
I think that the War Department really did understand that this is the role we need them to be in. We don't have the Army big enough to do these roles, and these men are here.
The first guns that were brought in were towed 155 millimeter guns.
I was really proud of my gun. My gun was #1 gun, and it was on alert at all times. #1 gun was the first gun to be fired if we had to fire it, and I was #1 breech man on that gun. We would compete against one another, #1 gun, #2, and 3 and 4. I thought we were doing a great job protecting our shorelines.
There was another point to this too, and that is not only were we looking out in the Atlantic and saying to the Germans, we're waiting for you, we're watching for you, we're ready for you. We were also saying to America, we're ready for them, we're watching for them. We have the ability to deal with them if they come.
Fire! You had to have been there. I mean, you had to be prepared. Their homes were right here, you know, and they were ready to fight and die and defend their homes.
Well, it was a little scary because we didn't know what was down the road, what was going to be coming at us.
Conquering armies now stood on the shores of the Atlantic. The danger was suddenly close.
We knew that Hitler had one heck of a navy. We were told quite a bit about it. He had a tremendous Air Force, and he had the SS troopers, and you know, he had quite an army, that guy did. We didn't know if he would attack this East Coast or not. That was the thing that was on my mind.
American coast artillery was very, very good. They were taught to fire 3 shots, and the 3rd shot is going to be on you.
December 7th, 1941 was a day that would change the lives of many Americans, including Horace Knowles.
I heard a knock come at the door, and they said, it was a soldier. He said, get back to the fort as quick as you can get there. He said, we've been attacked. Golly, who did that? He said, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. He said, we will now be at war. All I can visualize was that our boys in Hawaii were being killed. And the same thing could happen to us if the Germans had got in here on this East Coast. And the next day was the worst of it, when they told us the next day just how many were killed. It wasn't very pleasant.
When they read that 2,000 American sailors had been killed at Pearl Harbor, yeah, it's so far away, but American sailors had been killed and the country was at war, and suddenly attacked, just like we were attacked on 9/11. I'd ask people to think back to 9/11. I actually think back to September 12th, because in 9/11 we got attacked. Now these guys, their 9/11 was Pearl Harbor, where if on December the 6th you didn't care much about things, on December the 8th you really cared about it. Your whole life changed. America changed overnight. 16 million men and women were under arms. Every American male between the ages of 18 and 35 was involved in some way in the war effort.
At that time, we were looking out for a landing, an attack.
They were very afraid of German saboteurs coming ashore. So this beach was run by the military. You had to have a pass to be on it. It was patrolled on horseback. It was patrolled on foot.
Their base was now known as Fort Miles, and as troops stood watch, the guns of the 261st Coast Artillery were at the ready.
Any activity was on that ocean. Any activity, regardless of what it was, when we'd seen the ship, even our own ships, we would call in. The Navy would radio it in to the headquarters. And then, of course, we would immediately man the guns until the ship was identified. After it was identified, why, then that was the end of the drill. One night, there was a ship come in, and the Navy was flashing the Morse code out. They wouldn't answer. And so our orders at that time was to fire 3 shots. Fire 1 ahead of the ship, 2 over the ship, 3rd one to hit it. And we gave the orders to fire that night. Fired the 3 shots, but that shot went over the top of that ship, that shell. And they came out, and they were just waving sheets and everything, you know, and they stopped dead in the water, like that ship did. We took our training seriously. They had boats to pull the targets up and down the coast, and we won quite a few medals with those 155s. We were good, there's no getting around it. I'll brag about my outfit anytime against anybody. We were aces.
With the wartime buildup came more troops and more guns, big guns.
Hundreds of these men came here, first in a tent city, hundreds and hundreds of tents.
When we built Tent City, now that was an ordeal. And we had these little pot-belly stoves. And in the wintertime, God, it was cold. And they get that stoves fired up, and that stack going up out through the top of that tent would be cherry red. First thing you know, look up, you'd see a flame. The tent would be on fire. And then the latrines, oh, they were pitiful. But we managed. When we first came, we had to do a lot of labor work. We were assigned to different jobs to help the contractors that were working here.
They started pouring thousands of yards of concrete and setting these big underground bunkers in concrete and rebar to house these big guns.
One of those bunkers would be known as Battery 519, housing 2 big guns capable of firing monster 12-inch diameter shells.
The technical term is a casemate. It's built like Hoover Dam. The actual weight, we estimate, is about 100,000 tons. The guys here, because it was built by local Delaware guys, they built it better than it had to be built. The sand dune itself was excavated by the U.S. Army Engineering Department, the forerunner of the Corps of Engineers. The sand was all taken away, the forms were laid for the concrete was poured, the steel was put in, and then the guns were in place and the sand was put back. 2 big guns facing out, 2 12-inch guns. This particular gun behind me could take on an enemy 15 miles away.
Absolutely massive. Mounted on very heavy steel girders. These gun rooms were completely open to the elements, but the guns themselves would be on a kind of turntable and would have a shield in front of them to give the crew a modicum of protection from incoming fire.
The bunker, the casemate is 420 feet long inside. The guns themselves are serviced with a powder room and a shell room. So there's a powder room, a shell room at each end. Typically, this battle station would have somewhere around 100 men in it. It was a little self-contained city. It had its own power source, had its own water source, had its own food source. It was in radio contact with everybody else up and down the beach.
All right, you'll notice that there were different levels. And at some levels, it was just a regular lookout. At other levels, they were actually using the rangefinders.
They built these towers as fire control towers. They were used to provide fire control solutions for these guns.
And they knew the exact distance from that tower to a certain point, Each one of those tower levels, you've got different windows, was a different weapon system.
Their whole purpose was to spot and provide distance, range, and coordinates so that the plotting room could plot firing solutions, which would then be transmitted to the gun crews, and they would do that on an interval so that they could track the ships.
American coast artillery was very, very good. When the alert came, the first gun to take the enemy had 30 seconds, and they practiced that all the time.
When he is satisfied that the battery is ready to open fire, the command, "Commence firing," goes to all elements of the battery.
They had 3 minutes to get every gun on the enemy. These guys knew that body of water out there, every millimeter. And if you came in their comfort zone, they were taught to fire 3 shots. And the third shot is going to be on you.
Fire!
Every gun here ranges out to at least 15 miles. So you're under a blizzard of 6-inch shells, 2 12-inch shells coming at you, and 2 16-inch shells. And the guys were really, really good.
As the work of building Fort Miles continued, the men of the 261st settled in for the mission of guarding the coast.
And of course, when we moved into the barracks, it was altogether a different life. It looks like the same old barracks. We had nice bunks, mattresses, which we didn't have in Tent City. And we had running water, we had hot water, and the barracks was really nice. We were glad to have them. A lot of times we would be playing cards, you know, and we had radios. And of course, every payday we'd have a big crap game. And then other time we would sit there and play cards or shoot pool. It was just a great bunch of guys. Have your buddies, they would help you, protect you.
Even as soldiers of Fort Miles stood watch and their guns took aim, an unseen enemy was lurking off the coast.
The German fleet that came was the German submarine fleet.
We were mostly concerned with surface fleets, and then of course the Germans quickly changed the game by building their submarine fleet and wreaking havoc. You could stand out here on top of the Great Dune and at night see shipping on fire.
You could imagine being a soldier here and watching these ships being torpedoed and exploding out on the horizon, watching the glows from the fires out there. You can imagine how heartbreaking that must feel, or how helpless that must feel, but it brought the war home. The front lines were definitely here.
Hold coordinate. Ready? Mark!
Today, the history of Fort Miles is alive and well in the hearts and minds of a new generation of Americans. They seek to honor the memory of America's greatest generation of warfighters as the 261st Coast Artillery reenactors.
So what we're trying to do is capture that local unit here at Fort Miles, and we're trying to portray them as they were here during World War II. We chose the 261st because we wanted to reenact a unit that was relevant to here. We're replicating the daily life of the soldier here at Fort Miles, the weapons they were stationed on, how those operated, and bring that to life for the public. I've been a student of World War II since I was about 12 years old. When I found out this was a World War II fortification, someplace I could come and touch and sink my fingers into and really learn, I was hooked. And so I wanted to learn all I could about Fort Miles. Our volunteer force comes from everywhere. There's a lot of guys that come from as far away as Massachusetts and Texas. We've got one guy that drives from San Antonio to come out and be a part of these events that we hold annually.
As a unit, we try to stick to the specific date of 1942. Sometimes we have access to the actual unit rosters from 1942. We look down and, you know, 6 or 7 guys from the battery we actually reenact were from Rehoboth, which is my town. So I look at that, I'm like, man, you know, that could have been me if I was born 70 years ago. It's a really cool feeling.
My name is Anthony Valenti. I'm a tech corporal with the 261st Coast Artillery, and I'm also the battery clerk. I got started with Scott Wallon. He is the ordnance officer, and he pulled me right in, and I love it.
The shells, when they were called for at the breech of the gun, were taken out of the room, lifted up, taken across on a railway system, and delivered to the breech of the gun, down through the hallway.
Never really knew what was out here until my friend told me about it, and I met Dr. Gary Ray.
Reinforced, you can see the rebars inside.
Especially after Pearl Harbor. It was entirely, completely patriotic. They loved what they did. They were happy to be out here and be serving the country.
All right, what we have here is a 1942 weapon carrier Model 55. My name is Donald G. Hattier. I'm the first sergeant for the 261st Coast Artillery, based at Fort Miles, Delaware. The first sergeant's duties traditionally are taking care of the troops. Their bunks are fine, that they're properly fed. World War II is discussed in European theater, Africa. You got the China, Burma, India theater. You've got things that happen everywhere, but people rarely talk about the home front. And our coasts were really very actively defended, especially in the early part of the war. We need to be ever vigilant, even here in the United States, and that was the purpose of the 261st.
Oh yeah. Cool. There were a lot of people here at one time. Okay. Thanks. Be safe.
I think for a lot of us, and me in particular, I'm trying to convey to today's kids what it was like 60, 70 years ago. So these things, when they work, they work.
They were probably overrated for military purposes.
Most
anyway.
military things,
right.
even then.
Okay, my name is Michael Hills. I'm the chaplain for the 261st Coast Artillery, Battery C, Fort Miles, Delaware. The chaplain's duties would have been a variety of things, other than holding chapel services and religious services for the men. Would have been doing personal interviews and encouraging the men, would have been a counselor.
I think that for most of these guys, from what I gather, it is a way for them to thank the greatest generation and to educate the next generation on what it is they did here.
Some of the 261st reenactors are taking their devotion to the unit a step further, with service for real in the 198th Signal Battalion, part of the modern-day 261st Signal Brigade.
I wanted to join the military all my life, but being a part of this group of people and this family, and as a group, we are a family. The 261st is definitely a family. I wanted to experience that for real, and I wanted to wear the uniform for real. So that really encouraged me to go ahead and sign on the dotted line. I'm a specialist in the Delaware Army National Guard with 198th Signal Battalion, which means that we will go out and set up battlefield communications via satellite for warfighters on the ground overseas. And interestingly enough, I'm serving with the same unit that I reenact, which is pretty cool. I'm following in their footsteps. Horace Knowles is a perfect example. The things that he did out here at Fort Miles and the things that I do with my unit. 70 years apart, there's still parallels. And that brings me, I think, personally, a little bit closer to those veterans who served, and it just gives us that common thread. And I enjoy that very much.
A few of our guys that do reenacting here, and they're young, they're getting right out of high school, or have chosen to kind of carry the torch and carry it forward and getting ready to go to boot camp.
All my really close friends from this unit were all National Guard, and I'd always said, when the time came, I'd do it. And so far, I'm liking it. I'm nervous a lot because there's a lot of stuff coming.
Just seeing the way of life, being able to serve my country, I realized I really need a part in that. I'm thinking about either going active after college or joining the Delaware State Troopers, being a police officer.
My son is part of the 261st reenactment unit, such as myself. He's 16, and he's already talking about joining the military. I think they feel a real sense of duty by learning what they have here, realizing what the men and women that were in the armed forces in World War II had to do to preserve our heritage.
Supporters of Fort Miles' restoration are hoping to put some of the base history and lessons of World War II on display in a Battery 519 museum.
What they want to tell is first and foremost the story of Fort Miles in World War II. but also as it fits in to the larger Battle of the Atlantic. We want to talk about the men that were here, their jobs, what this place was really supposed to do, what it did do. We hear about the convoys and our own warships out on the ocean, but we don't often hear about the men standing back behind them on this shoreline. Walking that beach, watching. It wasn't just the guys that went across the oceans, but it was also mom and dad's war and sister and brother's war.
It's a story of our country being under siege, attacked, how we all respond as Americans. People say, well, it never fired its guns in anger, but you had to be ready. You know, you build things, hopefully, that you never have to use. But if you have to use them, they're there, so you use them. God help you if you don't have them to use.
The greatest sense of homeland security is what you and I can do. Well, these men did that. They didn't just sit home. They said, I'm going to be a part of this. A lot of them joined because this is a way that I can be a part of the defense of my state, literally in this case.
They should remember the first thing, that we were never attacked. We let Mr. Hitler know that he would never come into the United States. I mean, it was serious business. There weren't no play. We did what we had to do. And like I say, we were the best. At least I thought so. To be honest with you, I was proud of everything I did. It was just something that I know that I agreed to do when I signed up. If I had to do over, I would do it. I wouldn't hesitate.